Welcome to another program in our series, Centrally Speaking.
The program that keeps you informed on the work and function of Jamaica's central bank, Bank of Jamaica. I'm Anna.
And I'm Sheena, and we're so happy to be with you, our regular viewers. And for those of you who are tuning in for the very first time, welcome. We're happy you could join us.
So, Sheena, I'm going in a place.
Well, summer.
Olympics.
Olympics is on. What you know about Olympics?
I'm looking forward to that. Bolt and Chris Gayle race.
And about Chris Gayle alone, Winston Griffith.
Sheena.
What?
Winston Griffith's not race.
In race?
Not that kind of race there.
It doesn't matter. And Cristiano.
Somebody, Jesus.
Messi.
Somebody have to go. Somebody have to come forth.
Somebody.
You know that you're saying Chris face there.
So we have a great show lined up for you because our very special guest is no stranger to Centrally Speaking. He is Dr. Jide Lewis, Deputy Governor in charge of Financial Institutions Supervisory Division, and he's also the Deputy Supervisor of banks, financial holding companies, and other specified financial institutions.
Yes, Dr. Lewis will give us some more insight on the new standards for the operation of automated banking machines, or ABMs. But before we hear from Jide, we would love to hear from you, as usual. So you know what time it is, right? It's time for the Street Check.
Name at least one function of the Bank of Jamaica.
They're the banker to the government. And let me just be a little bit smart here. They're also the banker to other commercial banks.
The Bank of Jamaica, they're the banker to the government and they supervise the financial institution.
To ensure the free flow of cash in Jamaica.
They supervise financial sectors and they issue money.
They manage the bank's external reserve, is that it? And they're also a banker to the government.
In essence, they're like the head banks for all the other banks within Jamaica.
Always very interesting answers from the streets. How easy was it for you?
Well, can't tell you. We didn't know all of that.
Hey, you better.
What do you mean? Number one, issuing and redeeming Jamaican money.
Yeah. Number two.
Number two, being a banker to the government. Number three, a banker to commercial banks. Number four, managing Jamaica's external reserves. That means savings.
Yeah. Number five.
Financial sector supervision.
And number six.
Formulating and implementing monetary policy. Oh, my son.
Perfect.
Hey.
Steer good. But I know you're bright, man.
Yeah, man, I have a little sense.
And that was the Street Check.
Yeah. Now to our guest. Joining us now is Dr. Jide Lewis, Deputy Governor at Bank of Jamaica. Welcome back to Centrally Speaking.
Thank you so much for having me again.
Again. Yeah, it's always a pleasure. So, Dr. Lewis, we're going to go right into it. In April of this year, Bank of Jamaica launched its service level standards in terms of the operation of ABMs, right? And recently we had your governor, Richard Biles, and the JBA president, Audrey Tugwell, who told us about the service level standards. But for persons who were unable to view the program, share with us, what are some of the highlights of those service level standards?
Well, thank you so much for asking that question, Sheena. The service level standards are quite far-reaching. They cover things like the deployment of ABMs, cash availability, recovery time, issues to do with whether or not members of the public feel secure within when they're using ABMs, access to ABM facilities for members of the public that have physical disabilities, and financial education, just to name a few of the topics that are covered under these standards.
Thank you.
All right, so getting into it, the meat of the matter here. So one of the pain points that consumers have with the banks is the fees, right? And the level of fees that the banks charge. Now, what kind of regulation will BOJ apply to these fees, if it can at all?
Sure. So I want to be very clear that we haven't issued regulations in relation to these standards. What we have done is issued guidelines that we intend to monitor the banks in terms of their compliance with over time. In terms of fees, we have not regulated fees. We have set standards of reasonableness that banks must comply with when they're making submissions to us. Right. We look at whether or not those fees are grounded in the business model that they're offering and are consistent with what is happening within the industry, and whether or not they make sense in terms of the customer segments that they're going to be approaching. And so we're going to be monitoring mainly for reasonableness. They will apply to us with a submission, and we'll give them 30 days, get back to them. Of course, if we don't get back in 30 days, they can move ahead. But they will still have to notify their customers and give them 45 days before those fees are implemented.
Okay. So one of the highlights you spoke about was accessibility for persons who have disabilities, right? Share with us what that actually looks like, and how will this allow persons with disabilities to independently access ABMs?
Sure. So as you may know, Sheena,
yes,
the government would have issued a Disabilities Act back in 2014.
Yes.
And consistent with that thought process, within the standards, we have indicated that banks need to make facilities available for those who are physically challenged to access financial service. So it's a financial inclusion type of guideline. And so, for example, ramps being there for ABMs that are located outside of branches, ramps to access ABMs that are located within branches, and other facilities, for example, those who may have a visual impairment, questions such as whether or not the ABM has voice prompts that will prevent the person from having to ask someone else.
Which is a risk.
Which is a risk, because if you have to ask someone else to assist you, you may divulge sensitive information such as your PIN. And of course, that is a big no-no.
All right, so speaking of risks, Jide, another aspect of the regulations, or another aspect that the regulations cover, is safety and security. So how are we assured that going forward, that we'll be even more safe while using ABMs?
That was certainly an area of the guidelines that were issued in April that we focused on, and we did this in consultation. We worked with the FSC, just for context, and we also worked and got feedback from the banks themselves. And one of the points that came across in those discussions is that a one-size-fits-all standard for security would be very difficult to implement. So what we have embedded in the guideline is that each year, each bank is to do a risk assessment of the vulnerability of each location for their ABMs in terms of security risks. They are to use that review to inform the kind of security measures they require to either implement themselves or perhaps to delegate to another service provider for security purposes. And so that's the mechanism that's embedded within the standard to ensure or to assure members of the public that adequate safety measures would be implemented. And of course, what is a safety measure for an ABM that's located within a branch is going to look very different for a standalone ABM or an ABM that's located within, for example, another business property. And so what we tried to do was not to be too prescriptive where that was concerned, but ensure that there was clarity in terms of the process that each bank must follow in this regard. So one would expect that if a particular location has been a site for previous criminal activity, for example, it should go up in the rating, and then that particular DTI will require its service provider to perhaps carry armored trucks to that area or have backup teams available. And so that was the approach that was taken in this guideline.
Okay, so I want to follow on that. All right, so based on the security requirements, it sounds a little nuanced because you have security requirements in bank as opposed to ABM and so forth. Is there an obligation on the part of financial institutions to teach their consumers about the safe use of ABMs?
Absolutely. That's one of the areas that is covered in the guideline. And in fact, consumer education has two roles. One, to ensure that consumers can get the benefits from using these facilities, as well as to ensure that they can avoid the risks associated. There can be different risks posed to using any financial product. And so what we want to do, for example, our expectation rather, would be that banks will be educating customers on how to identify red flags when you're using an ABM. For example, if the lock is broken, is that a safe ABM to use. If you notice that there's a device that's attached to the ABM, is that a safe ABM to use? Should you instead report that ABM to the bank for them to do an investigation before you proceed to do a transaction? And so we really want to partner with the banks in this regard to ensure that members of the public can get the best of the financial services that are being offered while avoiding some of the challenges of operating in the Jamaican space.
All right, so Jide, I want to switch the conversation on from the ATMs now to something that I think might be find of interest to our viewers. This is credit cards.
Sure.
Now, how can we encourage, or what can we tell the regular consumer the best practice to use a credit card, how to manage their credit cards in terms of fees and all the other risks that are associated?
Sure. Well, first of all, under the Code of Conduct 2016, banks are required to disclose all the fees and charges associated with using any financial instrument.
All right.
And so the first advice I would say is to make sure that they have access to the terms and conditions of use of the credit card and that they go through that particular document. If they do not understand, the banks have an obligation to them to explain it to them in simple and clear language. So first of all, knowledge is power, and that's the first advice that I would give to anybody who's using any instrument, including a credit card. The second is to understand the product. And what is a credit card? A credit card is really an unsecured lending facility for usually 1 month. And so therefore, within that 1 month, you actually don't pay an interest rate. So if you pay back that credit card debt in full and before the due date or on the due date, then you incur no interest rate charges. You only incur interest rate charges when you pay the minimum amount, and then the residual balance on the credit card then accrues at the interest rate that is stated in the terms and conditions of that particular facility. And so that would be the advice. Understand the product, understand how it's useful to you based on your particular circumstances. If you need unsecured borrowing for 1 month and you know you can pay it back in full before the due date or at the due date, then it's a good product for you. If you do not think you can do that, then it would be best perhaps to think of another product offered by that institution or another financial institution that suits your particular need.
Thanks for that response, Jide. Now, based on where we started, ABMs, and we've evolved now to credit cards, we know that banking services are quite expensive.
Sure.
So in view of that, will Bank of Jamaica be issuing any additional service level standards?
You know, Sheena, once the minister gave his pronouncement in terms of Twin Peaks last year, April, we have embarked on a body of work to help us transition to that regime. And part of that will be establishing the FSC as that consumer protection body within the financial sector. But we're not going to wait until that point. We're actually going to be building out other guidelines, and then when the major act is promulgated in Parliament, then these guidelines will be converted into regulations where they'll have binding effect. So that's just like a preview of what the next couple of months will look like. But you know, because you asked so nicely, I'll give you a little prips
I like that.
as to what we could be looking at next. For example, so we do know that a pain point in the country has been around how banks manage consumer complaints, particularly in the context of frauds. And so we're going to be looking perhaps at a set of guidelines that would try to address that issue. And think about other topics as informed by our engagements with the banks, members of the public, and our other stakeholders.
So viewers, we got a little prips, but it's time for a break. Centrally speaking, we'll be right back.
Welcome back. You are watching Centrally Speaking. In case you've just joined us, our guest today is Dr. Jide Lewis, Deputy Governor at BOJ, and we have been discussing issues affecting the banking sector, issues such as banking fees. So, Jide, we hear BOJ talk about the Code of Conduct. what does Bank of Jamaica has to say about the code of conduct involving commercial banks?
Sure. So within the Code of Conduct, which was passed in 2016, the banks are required to make disclosures of all fees and charges attendant to any financial product that they're offering to members of the public. And that must be written, documented in clear and simple language so that they can review and evaluate that decision whether or not to pursue that particular product. The same principle is embedded in the guidelines for ABMs, where essentially we want to make sure that consumers can compare the price associated with accessing, in that particular case, ABM services. So, for example, if you're using an ABM for another bank, you'd want to be clear what the fees and charges are associated with using that particular ABM to do your transaction.
Okay, so since we need to be clear in terms of those fees, does Bank of Jamaica publish the fees as issued by commercial banks?
So we do that compilation on an annual basis. Those fees and charges are actually posted on our BOJ website, www.boj.org.jm. And very well. And so we do publish that, and that allows members of the public, one mechanism, by the way, that allows members of the public to quickly compare across banks what are the comparable fees for doing a particular or accessing a particular financial service. So that's one facility that we have. But there are also other facilities. So, for example, there are requirements for banks themselves to post on their own websites the fees and charges associated with accessing their products. And so a member of the public can go on their website and see exactly and do that comparison. The intent is we want members of the public to be able to make a good decision in terms of who they choose to do banking services with, and the basis upon which they're making that decision should be clear.
So, Jide, there is a lot of skepticism about whether or not the guidelines will be effective or will even have an impact. Share with us, what are your thoughts on this?
Yes, I've been reading the comments as well, Sheena, on social media and various other platforms. And I do understand the skepticism that's out there, because if you've been going through a particular experience, it's hard to believe that it's going to change just with a magic wand. Last year was a confluence of factors. We had the attacks on the vehicles that were delivering the cash to ABMs. We had the change in the currency, the note, new bank notes. We had a number of other things that were happening. Some of them were even really peculiar to each bank, so having gone through that particular ordeal, I think that the skepticism is understandable. But what I would say to members of the public is to give the guidelines some time, right? And trust that the banks crave and guard, maybe it's a better way to put it, banks guard their reputations. And one of the things that we did with this guideline is to embed reporting standards, as I had mentioned, so the public can see how they're performing every month, right? So what that does, it lends to transparency. And so I don't know if you'd understand this analogy, but just imagine, would you have a bolt unless you had a Gatling?
Yeah, that's true.
I understand. So nothing like competition where you're in the arena and all eyes are on you and everybody is going to see how you perform. And, what we're anticipating is that banks will rise to the occasion and improve their service level standards to the public. And I would share with you just a little bit that I've seen the March report for ABM standards and their performance of each of the banks. And we're seeing improvement. We're seeing where, for example, in January, only 93% of all ABMs were functioning. That number has jumped to 97% of all ABMs across the island functioning for the month of March. And so that's the improvement that we are hoping to see. No, we're not there yet. So, for example, in terms of uptime, banks are still on average around 90 to 91% in terms of uptime. And so we'd love to see that creep up to the 95%, which is embedded in the guidelines. And in terms of recovery time, which under the guidelines is 3 hours for rural areas, urban and other urban areas, 1 hour to fix the machines and get them back in operation. We're still seeing where they're lagging behind there. But let's give it some time.
Okay.
All right, so Jide, I'm asking this in the context that you are the Deputy Supervisor of Banks. It's a two-part. One, if a customer has an issue with a bank, what is the way or the best way to, as we say in Jamaica, lodge a complaint?
Sure.
And referencing your earlier guidance about the time frame in which a bank should notify its customers about an impending change of fees. You know, what is considered a notification channel? Is it through radio, TV, text?
Sure,
Yeah, right.
sure. So I'll handle both of those. The first question, members of the public under the code are encouraged to go to their bank first to lodge their complaints. Banks are required to notify, put on their website who the complaint should be lodged to, and the form that complaint should be communicated to the bank. So each bank has that obligation. So the customer will first go to their bank and say, here's the issue that I'm facing and here's the evidence of the issue that I'm facing. The bank has an obligation then to give them a complaint number. And that's a number that I want to encourage every complainant to keep because it allows you to continue the conversation. So let's say you started the complaint on the phone and they gave you the number and the line, you ran out of credit, for example. Then you can then quote that number and then the bank must find all the material for your complaint rather than you starting over again. Right? So now, if the bank does not acknowledge the complaint within 5 days, then that's a breach of the code. If the bank doesn't resolve the complaint within 45 days, that is to investigate it and come to a determination whether or not there's a legitimate claim or whether or not, in fact, there is no claim on the bank, then they must complete that within 45 working days. So that's the procedure. When that is not working out, the code says that the member of the public or the customer can then write to the Bank of Jamaica. And our email address is customer.complaints@boj.org.jm. That's customer.complaints@boj.org.jm. And they can write. And I look at those complaints personally. I then write to the bank and let them know the issue, and then I will require them to do a further investigation into the matter.
All right, supervisor spoken.
Yes, so today you started off.
You did ask another question.
Yes. The notification. What
constitutes a notification? We are not prescriptive in the Code of Conduct in terms of what constitutes a notification. What we have said is that they should be using a mechanism that makes sense for their customer segment. So for example, if their customer segment all have mobile phones, we'd expect that to be using text messages. If their customer segment likes written letters, then we'd expect that they'd be using pamphlets. Those who are younger may use social media. And so banks need to innovate and think, well, what's the best way to communicate to my client base what my intentions are in terms of fees and charges? And then they would use that mechanism to do that communication. The anchor here is reasonableness. They must make all reasonable efforts to communicate to their customers in relation to an impending change in fees, particularly if it's up. Right?
And there you have it, Dr. Jide Lewis, Deputy Governor at Bank of Jamaica with responsibility for Financial Institutions Supervisory Division and Supervisor of Banks, Financial Holding Companies and other specified financial institutions. On today's episode, we spoke to Dr. Jide Lewis, Deputy Governor at Bank of Jamaica, about issues affecting the banking sector. Here's a recap of the conversation. It's now time for Fast Facts. Number 1. The new ABM standards are designed to address critical areas including the deployment and accessibility of ABMs, cash availability, client safety and security, and financial education of ABM users. Number 2. Bank of Jamaica does not dictate ABM fees and charges, but issues guidelines that require banks to apply to BOJ prior to implementing or increasing any fee or charge. The change in fees and charges must be reasonable, justified, and transparent. Number 3. BOJ requires that banks conduct an annual risk assessment of all their ABMs and then adjust their security protocol to ensure that members of the public are safe when using their services. Number 4. Financial institutions are required to ensure that the requisite infrastructure and technology are in place at ABMs to improve customer experience, particularly for the elderly and disabled. Number 5. Fees and charges associated with banking services are published annually on the Bank of Jamaica website at boj.org.jm. And now for our bonus fact, number 6. Under the Code of Conduct, each bank has an obligation to publish on their website the process for lodging a complaint. And that's it for our Fast Facts. That's our program for this week.
Unfortunately,
Yeah.
sure done quick to the man. But follow us on X and Facebook at Central Bank JA, at Central Bank Jamaica on Instagram, and on BOJ's YouTube channel. You can also visit our website, boj.org.jm.
We also invite you to send your questions on X or Facebook.
And of course, watch us again next week at the same time right here on your station when we'll have another special guest. Thanks for watching. I'm Anna.
And I'm Sheena. See you next week.
See you next week.
Centrally Speaking is a production of Bank of Jamaica.